We are not prone to hyperbole here, but it's hard to overstate the scale and long-standing effect of the 2008 financial crisis. At the time, it seemed almost inconceivable, and it was certainly difficult to grasp what was happening as it all unraveled. That task becomes much easier today, particularly with the book that's just won the 2019 Lionel Gelber Prize for literary nonfiction. It's called Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. It was written by Adam Tooze. He is the Shelby Cullum Davis Chair of History at Columbia University and director of its European Institute. And Adam Tooze joins us now for more. Great to have you here, and congratulations to you on the Gelber Prize. That's a terrific achievement.
Thank you very much.
Well done. I want to start taking you back over a decade, September 18th, 2008. Chairman of the Fed, Ben Bernanke, said before a congressional committee, "If we don't do this, we may not have an economy on Monday." Did he really believe what he was saying, in your view?
I do think he did. I mean, there's an obvious suspicion that this is a man under enormous pressure. He needs Congress to act. He may be trying to scare the politicians. Sure. But I actually think that the situation that confronted them in those weeks in September was as grievous as that. So I think this is essentially a sincere insight into how terrifying the world looked at that moment. Ben Bernanke is, after all, also a great expert on economic history. He had worked previously on the history of the Great Depression. He also went on record to say that this was the worst depression bar none, or the worst threat to the global financial system.
And you don't agree with that?
I do agree with that. It was indeed the worst threat that the global financial system has ever witnessed. And why? Because what we saw in those weeks in September 2008 was the possibility of the simultaneous implosion of all of the major banks on both sides of the Atlantic. And even places like Canada that were relatively safe in the first wave would not have survived intact if all of Wall Street, the City of London, Paris, Frankfurt, and then spiraling out from that, Seoul, Moscow, Singapore had come down in the way they threatened to do. So no, I think we need to take Bernanke absolutely seriously here, apart from the fact it's quite difficult to imagine what it means that we won't have an economy.
Right.
But what he means is that the financial system will seize up, and that's like a heart attack.
But he said, if we don't do this, what was the this he was referring to?
Or what he was asking for was hundreds of billions of dollars in authorization from Congress, which initially they were planning to put into a half-baked scheme to buy up damaged assets. This was the so-called Troubled Assets Relief Program, TARP, and which they then have the good sense to realize is a very bad way of going around stabilizing the US economy, and instead they use it to recapitalize America's banks. But that's what he's asking for. What he's asking for is legislative backing for emergency action on an unprecedented scale.
I do want to just push back a little bit on the notion that this was as bad as the Great Depression back in the 1920s and 30s, in as much as, you know, unemployment rates were 25% then. We didn't have that this time.
The crucial thing here is to distinguish between the risk and the actuality.
Okay.
So the Great Depression is, you're absolutely right, the worst crisis that we have so far experienced and lived through. Indeed, the major index of that is the loss of jobs and the fact that it was sustained, after all the way essentially through to the mid-1930s, and the US economy is clawing its way back. This event in 2008 is more like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We saw the end of the world and steered away from it. But even in 2008, the rate of job losses in the fall of 2008 is as rapid as during the worst moments of the 1930s crisis. The collapse in global trade is even more severe in 2008-9 than it was in 1929. If you go month by month and benchmark the crises against the beginning and then look 6 months in, where are we at? By the spring of 2009, it was looking worse than it was in 1930 relative to 1929. So the crucial question is, what did they do to prevent the disaster?
And they did prevent it.
They did prevent the absolutely
worst. And
worst.
actually, let's dive down a little deeper on that, because the Republicans are supposed to be the party of Wall Street, and yet it was the Republicans who seemed not completely, but mostly opposed to what Barack Obama ended up doing that saved the financial world.
And even more tellingly, their own president, Bush, was doing in 2007-8. The crisis begins in 2007. It's quite clear by the spring and summer of 2008 that it's already an existential threat, not just to the American economy or to some remote banks in Wall Street, but to the fabric of middle-class American life. And I mean by that the English sense of middle class. In other words, property-owning democracy is at risk. And the Republican Party goes AWOL. If you're looking for a moment at which Donald Trump becomes possible, you're looking for a moment at which the Republican Party stops functioning in the way we might understand as a party of government and becomes instead a kind of emotive sounding board for freaked out conservative Americans. 2008 is that moment, because faced with the collapse of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the backstops of the entire mortgage system, not the subprime stuff, but the fundament of basic home ownership in the United States, which were going down in the summer of 2008, the Republican congressional leadership tells Hank Paulson and the White House not even to ask for their votes, because it's going to be embarrassing. And so the entire crisis-fighting effort, because America has division of powers, is in fact carried by the majority the Democrats won in 2006 in the congressional midterms.
Somehow the Republican congressional representatives could not get their head around the notion that Main Street would be bailing out Wall Street. Yeah. And therefore, they just couldn't go there.
And they have a dogmatic resistance to big government, which they see as the ultimate threat to the American dream. So better, if you like, to go through the fire of a complete collapse and, as it were, from that then to rebuild. And this, again, is a theme that we see in Republican politics all the way down to the present day, a kind of catastrophist. Let's just scrap Obamacare and see what happens next, right? That kind of a catastrophist vision of politics emerges in that summer. Of course, it isn't all Republicans, but what we're seeing is the tail wagging the dog, where you have a minority of really radicalized, and I think that's the right word to use for them, that congregate around the Freedom Caucus, that then we'll see in the Tea Party, on the streets and the communities of the United States, and keep reassembling. They have different names each time round. But it's those people that will also hold America's government budget hostage in 2011 and 2013, the first shutdown threats. So that group is already crystallizing and indeed saying, even if this seems necessary for the systemic rescue of American capitalism, which our party traditionally has really been quite committed to, not with us, that we're not going to play along.
Now, a decade ago, there were sort of numerous competing theories as to why all this happened and who may have been responsible for it. A decade later, 600 pages later in your book, are you convinced that there is a consensus now as to what caused the financial turmoil?
No, I don't think there's a consensus, but I do think there's a right answer.
Okay.
Right. And you saw that even in the anniversary struggles that were going on, and a much heavier hitter players than myself, like Bernanke and Paulson and Geithner, were having it out in the pages of the New York Times with their critics in 2018. And the crucial question is this fundamentally a story about a real estate boom that went bust? Is that the basic story?
Subprime mortgages
The
and all
subprime
that.
mortgage story. And more importantly, perhaps, the effect that had on millions of American households, and then not just Americans, but Irish, Spanish, around the world. So it's a story driven by real people and a real, as it were, economic crisis, overinvestment in housing. Or is that simply the trigger for the main event? And the main event is the bursting of the financial bubble and the implosion of the banks themselves. In other words, we have a mortgage-driven balance sheet story about households and the damage they suffered, and we have a bank-centered bank-run story. And I think the evidence is unambiguous that it's really the latter that's what makes 2008 different. Because the losses from the first round are very comparable, say, to the dot-com bubble bursting. And what that induces in the American economy, and then spiraling out from that the rest of the world, is a bad bout of the flu. In other words, we get a recession, people postpone investment, cut back consumption, the economy slows down, we get higher unemployment. That's not what we were seeing in 2008. What we were seeing in 2008 is a heart attack. That moment when Bernanke says, we won't have an economy on Monday unless we act now. That's how fast the bank run operates. And this bank run was big enough to have done that, to have taken the entire economy down.
The fact that many of our international financial systems were so interconnected, how much of a role did that have in all of this?
Absolutely crucial. And this is the other element that makes 2008 different from any previous crisis, is it literally would have taken down the City of London and Wall Street within hours of each other, because globalization was for real. It wasn't just some sort of story that we told at Davos or whatever. The financial system of the world was massively interconnected, such that European banks were huge players in the American subprime story. I mean, Deutsche Bank basically foreclosed on Cleveland. And at the same time, American money market mutual funds, which are what people put their retirement savings into, were funding the debts of European banks. So we have a hugely tight interconnection. And if you want to see the ultimate proof of this, just look at the balance sheet of the Fed and which banks are they providing support to. Not the headline stuff in the newspapers where we're talking about the American taxpayer on the hook for the shares of AIG or whatever, but the liquidity support, bank-to-bank support the Fed is providing to the global banks. More than half of that is going to European banks, not American banks. So that gives you a sense of how pressured this system is.
How foreseeable do you think any of this was?
I think now, in retrospect, with the analytic that we now have, and I think I would emphasize this, to that extent I'm actually an optimist, we understand better how this happened. And it is a major cognitive shift because what it requires us to do is to take the financial system seriously as a source of potential crisis. As I was always saying, this is still disputed. There are people who insist, no, this is a real estate thing. And economists have a really hard time, you wouldn't believe this perhaps as a layperson, understanding the significance of money and finance. In their models, it often is just radically excluded because they think money is like language. It's really just a veil. It's just a means of communication. It doesn't have an independent force as a driver of economic crisis. And that's what we've learned. We do now not understand that you have to monitor the balance sheets of the top 20 to 30 banks around the world to have any idea of how robust and how stable this system is. And that is what we're now doing.
I think the three most quoted letters in the United States these days are not USA, they are AOC. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the Democratic Congresswoman from the state of New York. We want to play a clip of her. She's got Jamie Dimon, the chairman and CEO of JP Morgan, in front of her. And, well, here's AOC in action. Please, the clip, Sheldon.
Do you think that the failure to hold more people accountable for the 2008 crisis is a failure of our legal system?
Look, you have to talk to a lot of legal experts about why more people didn't, whether they deserve to, whether they broke the law, what's intent, what's not intent. But you have to talk to legal experts about that.
Well, I'll talk to you about it. Nobody went to jail. Should somebody have gone to jail?
I think from a political point of view, it would have been really much better if they had been able to, because there's no doubt that there is a sense of righteous injustice, of a real frustration at this calamity that was inflicted on not just American society, but societies around the world by this crisis. This is the biggest forced movement of American families since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. You know, huge communities were reshuffled by the foreclosure epidemic. So there's a huge sense of pain, and the idea that no one is personally responsible for that is just unacceptable as an idea.
Who's in your rogues gallery?
So there I think you then need to start looking at individual bank executives. But the problem is, and this is the Jamie Dimon defense, is that almost all of the key drivers of this crisis were not really in the criminal category. This was a crisis produced by the ordinary, perfectly legal functioning of capitalism. And that is, I think, the disjunction that we need to wrap our heads around and is so difficult for politicians then to communicate. And this is the dilemma, in a few sense, and also the disaster, the tragedy of the Obama administration, is that it bought fully into the other side. In other words, this was a systemic crisis. There really was no criminal culpability. People just took gigantic risks that were, had terrible consequences. They didn't even manage to inflict fines or the equivalent, which is out-of-court settlements of a gigantic scale, quickly enough so that the relationship between the disaster and the punishment had any kind of moral meaning.
They took ridiculous financial risks and were encouraged to do so by bond rating agencies, by public institutions, by politicians. So there's lots of guilt to go around.
There's a huge amount of guilt, but whether any of it meets the standard of criminal liability is the fundamental question. And so what I'm in fact saying is it might have been worth the candle of just trying to prosecute. Right? Going through the arguments, even if somebody is not ultimately found guilty, at least you show the willingness to force the case and let them prove their innocence.
And might have averted a populist spasm that led to Trump?
This is one of the considerations, I think, but we have to be very careful here. I mean, the people who vote for Trump, very few of them are voting for Trump because they think that the banks were bailed out and that's the problem. Those are the people who vote for Sanders. Right? On the left, there is no question. And I think this hypothesis is one that really tortures Democrats in the United States because they ask where their voters went in 2016, why they didn't turn out for Hillary. And the answer, I think, there is something like this. Trump supporters are not people who rallied against bailouts for Wall Street. Generally speaking, they have the same kind of cynical attitude as Trump himself, which is, if they can get away with it, well, all power to them. Let's maybe think of some mechanism for stopping this. The Tea Party was a rally against even the whisper of the idea that money would be used by the federal government not to bail out banks, but to bail out the homeowner next door. It's a classic anti-welfarist and low-level, as this is typical in the United States, a low-level racist campaign against the idea of the expansion of welfare. It's an anti-big government protest. And that, I think, is a much more direct continuity.
Presumably, there are lessons to be learned from all of what we have been through over the last decade. Are you satisfied that you think the financial community has learned the lessons and has implemented them?
Not satisfied would be, evidently not. We didn't undertake massive structural reform of the American banking system. We've ended up with banks which are even larger. Under the Obama administration and a hypothetical successor, one could have imagined a progressive tightening of the regulations, a more and more intrusive regime for actually managing how banks handle risk. And then now we're seeing the exact opposite.
That's how we do it here.
Yeah.
That's how we do it in Canada.
And on that basis, banks can be made stable and can be made to be functioning mechanisms. In Europe, we've seen, not across the entire board, but in Switzerland, for instance, which is not part of the Eurozone, a complete transformation in the business model of the two biggest banks there, UBS and Credit Suisse. Now, this isn't the end of capitalism in Switzerland or the end of Swiss banking, but those banks no longer pose an existential threat to their country. So you can make those kind of changes. What we ended up with was a kind of mixture. We ended up with some quite effective technocratic change, basic continuity in the structure of American banking, which is in fact now going from strength to strength and out-competing its European rivals and expanding into new emerging market possibilities, for instance, and going head-to-head with the Asian competitors. And on the political front, and this is decisive, the political support which was there in the aftermath of the crisis for the regulators to go at the banks, that, of course, has evaporated. And I think that's where people like AOC come into the picture as potential game changers 2 years down the line. If the Democrats can actually shift the balance of power in the United States, there is now a call, not just in the financial sector, but across corporate America, for much more aggressive antitrust regulation. And that's a very interesting effect of the crisis, is it shifted the focus not just from Wall Street, which is where it started, to a much more comprehensive critique of oligarchy and oligopoly in the US.
Well, it also shifted the balance of power financially, internationally, to China in a very real way.
Yes.
Is that a good thing in your view?
Well, it's a logical development of a process of economic growth which we have never, ever seen before, literally in the record of modern history or, frankly, any previous period of human experience. No large entity the size of China has ever grown at the rate that it does. And furthermore, of course, it is the lineal descendant of a revolutionary communist party, which is still maintaining an authoritarian regime. On the one hand, this is delivering material benefits to a huge population, which, again, we have never seen at this pace and depth before. But the consequences, both for politics, in the sense that the Communist Party reaps the benefit from this, and on the other hand, also financial stability, I think, are still a big question mark, because the build-up of debt in the private sector and in bits of the Chinese public sector, and the China is so huge that a local debt in China is the size of the entire Canadian public sector. Those risks are very opaque. And what we do know is Beijing is working really hard to try and contain them, which tells us, I think, how serious those risks might be. So a good thing, bad thing, really it's too soon to tell.
I have never been less happy to say, in our last minute, because I'd love to talk to you for another hour, 10 years ago, precious few people were sounding the alarm that this was coming down the road. As you look on the horizon right now, do you see anything we ought to worry about?
We're not out of the woods in Europe. Italy is still a real issue. And I think the other thing to look at is China. Those are the two real zones that worry me deeply. So the Eurozone construction remains fundamentally fragile. The banking system in Europe is still weak, and the politics in Italy look increasingly desperate. So that, I think, is where my immediate, as a European, that's where my most immediate concern is directed. And then from the point of view of global balance, there's no doubt at all that the financial risks inside China and the development of the Chinese growth model over the next decade or so is really the big question mark for the global economy.
It's an absolutely fascinating book. Adam Tooze, congratulations again on your Gelber Prize victory. The book is called Crashed: How a Decade of Financial Crises, plural, changed the world. Thanks so much for visiting us at TVO tonight.
Thank you for having me on.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.